for 75 years, certainly we've not had a national security strategy or, white papers on many of these things. There can be an argument that it would be helpful to have at least, even in the public domain. But very often, the other point that I would like to share with our viewers is that a national security strategy often is a misnomer for what is a national security policy document. So it could probably look at what are the objectives that we want to achieve. The national security strategy then achieves that.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. You're on our daily evening program, The Gist. I'm Nitin Gokhale. Of late, say for the past couple of months, there have been lots of speculative and forward-looking reports, if I may say so, on how the Indian plan or Indian military's plan to form joint theatre commands is going to take place, and what is the roadmap for implementation of the plans that are drawn up by the military collectively. And in that context, some of the commentary has mentioned that while theaterization is inevitable and it is just around the corner, it is also distressing to note that India does not have a national security strategy, and flowing from it, defense doctrine is not available, at least in the public domain. And therefore, this entire exercise is a halfway house or is futile, is what some commentators maintain. But what is the reality? Is a national security strategy really mandatory for forming theatre commands and bringing in jointness and integration of the three armed forces? To discuss all that, and not really debate, but discuss that, I have with me a scholar, a warrior, Rear Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande, not an unfamiliar face to our viewers, and someone who has written a detailed series of articles on this on our own portal, bharatshakti.in, some years ago, and has continuously studied this issue for us as well as for his own benefit, and for writing various articles and taking part in discussions. So welcome to this program, Admiral Shrikhande. In fact, let me begin by asking you, where do you think the national security strategy fits into a nation's planning or in the military's planning? And is it mandatory to have a national security strategy to form theatre commands as India is about to do?
Thank you, Nitin, for having me discussing this with you. It's a pleasure as always. I would say that in theory and to a great extent in practice, a national security strategy could be a useful document. It would depend on how useful we make it out to be, and how deeply impactful it is. At this stage, I'm not talking about whether it would be an open document, a public document, or internal to the higher echelons of the government, the various ministries, and the National Security Council, as well as the Armed Forces Headquarters, etc., including the CDS and his fellow chiefs and their own staffs. We do not know at this stage whether such a document exists or not. But such documents have been part of what some nations have done for a long time. And let me just, for the benefit of your viewers, just say here that in the US, the national security strategy was mandated only in 1986. Under, it's towards the end of the Goldwater-Nichols Act. The Goldwater-Nichols Act itself, as you have yourself, I think, brought out in some earlier program, is subject to a lot of misinterpretations, perhaps for the reason that most people haven't read it, or hadn't read it at least till a few years ago. But they presume that a lot of things that they hope they are in it are actually in it. But the things were quite different. The other aspect, of course, is that national security strategies which were mandated by the Goldwater-Nichols Act began. The first one was in 1987, and between 1987 to I think 90, 98, that is in the first 11 years, there were 9 of them. And overall, in 36 years of the mandate for writing a national security strategy every year, there have been only 19 that have been published. So in many years, they have not been published at all. In fact, during President Trump's time, only one was published. And in President Biden's time, in the current term, you can say one and a half, because one was an interim national security strategy and another one was published in October 22. Now, uh, uh, a little less well known is that Russia also produces a national security strategy. In fact, um, I think just noted it down that they published one um, in July 21. This was about, say, 6 or 7 months before, they rolled into further into Ukraine. And in 23, they've, also published the concept of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. So that is a policy directive, whereas the national security strategy is a security strategy, which means it must show a way to achieve their ends. Now, the other question that viewers can think about is that the publication of such strategies ought to also yield with a reasonable, degree of uh, possibility of reverses of even failures. It should generally succeed. And if we see now, the Americans, despite the national security strategies, haven't done strategically well in two of their, very long wars. Uh, they haven't done strategically well even in the economic warfare that they, initiated against against their adversaries, because perhaps, adequate planning was not done for those segments. And this, likewise, we can say that even in Russia, the previous national security strategy was in 2015, which was after the reattachment of Crimea to the Russian Federation in 2014, and then so with in after the 21 strategy, it would be logical to imagine that they ought to have done better in what they were trying, what they set out to do in Ukraine. I mean, a national security strategy, just because it is published or it is written, does not provide that kind of guidance. The other aspect, like one Western analyst has said, who I've quoted in the article that was published on Bharat Shakti, a few weeks ago, maybe over a month ago, I think, uh, also mentioned that he felt that despite the uses of the national security strategy, the unclassified versions after the Goldwater Nichols Act have more and more tended to be what he called, quote unquote, exercises in extended speech writing. So, now here it is that sometimes you can make a document so palatable or, so acceptable and therefore fairly vague, which means it's no longer a roadmap that can be usefully used by your own people to succeed in the strategy, allowing for counter strategies of the adversary or from the environment itself. So that is the problem with national security strategies also. And I'm saying this because I've studied US, national security strategies quite deeply. The Russian ones a little less so. The Chinese have also been, publishing their defense white papers regularly. But you find that having published something, they have also made departures, which means you publish a strategy but do not follow it. In which case, the question that we should ask is, was it therefore a roadmap? So,
That's a very valid question. That's a very valid question you've raised at the end of your remark, the first answer that you've given. But that then begs the question again, whether India has the strategic culture and the strategic depth in its own establishment or even outside the establishment to evolve a national security strategy. And with coming back to the theaterization issue, uh, does guidance really be a compulsory mandate that they must have, the armed forces must have, to evolve their own doctrine or of integration and jointness? Because some people have again mentioned that without the national security strategy, no integration or no movement forward on theaterization can happen. What's your view in the Indian context then?
okay. Uh, I would say that there is enough strategic, weight in all organs of the government. I mean, a national security strategy can tap into, external advisors, subject matter experts, uh, you know, even serving or retired people from, various government and even non-governmental entities like corporations, perhaps, to come up with a roadmap that the that encompasses the diplomatic, informational, intelligence, military, and economic lines of statecraft. The national security strategy has to be the strategy of statecraft itself. It cannot have the military component as its main one. That has to come to the national defense strategy, of course, which then sort of take derive certain guidance from the national security strategy. I would say the other part that would it be an inhibitor? Uh, you know, like I've suggested in the article, if I know what I want in another document, I can make that assumption and start acting according to plan. Now, for 75 years, certainly we've not had a national security strategy or white papers on many of these things. Um, there can be an argument that it would be helpful to have at least, uh, even in the public domain. But very often, the other point that I would like to share with our viewers is that a national security strategy often is a misnomer for what is a national security policy document. So it could probably look at what are the objectives that we want to achieve. The national security strategy then achieves that. So it could very often, much of what goes by the NSS in some countries are actually more policy documents than strategic guidelines, and that is the problem. Again, the armed forces, know what the larger threats are, what are the dynamics of security threats that face the country, and we discuss this all the time while in service, or right now when one travels for conferences or for lectures into classrooms with mid-level and junior level officers also. They we discuss these problems. So there is in fact a great awareness. So I would say that throughout the armed forces, throughout the foreign ministry, economics ministry, etc., there is a lot of strategic depth in the thinking, and perhaps some of it has been brought together to to make out a national security strategy, a national security policy before that, which you and I may simply not be aware of. But because we are not aware of, and the government, any government is under no obligation uh, to put out everything in the public domain. Like Voltaire said in the article that I've quoted, it was the classified versions of since 1945 of various documents, which in fact then set the jointness as we see it today in the US started evolving from those the National Security Act, etc., of 1947 onwards. So the Goldwater Nichols Act was only a culmination for that, which mandated this. The other point we can probably ask each other is that if we are promulgating a national security strategy annually, as is required actually in the US, but many presidents wisely, ignore something that has been legislated, because you can't really put out a document like this every year and hope to make it still meaningful. Which means something that you do is valid in terms of statecraft only for 364 days.
That's right. So it's
So
like
the
a
issue.
yeah, actually, it's like meeting the deadline and sort of fulfilling a mandate which is there. That's what most often it happens when you do it annually. I suppose that's my viewpoint. But often in India and in some other countries, it is seen when inputs are sought to be given to the highest echelons of the government. The armed forces tend to have this notion that the wish list that they have for platforms and equipment and arms that they want to use should also be included in the national security strategy, which then locks the government into sort of committing to what the armed forces are looking for, a kind of a wish list. Uh, does that, work, or do you think that's actually a wishful thinking?
I guess from my interactions with some people privately in smaller groups, when people discuss about the need for an NSS, one does get a sense that people want their sort of, as you mentioned, their wish list to be somehow reflected in a higher document, a document that is put out in the name of the cabinet, perhaps, which a national security strategy. After all, NSS in the US and in Russia are signed by the president of that country. So our NSS would be signed, perhaps by the Prime Minister himself or by the cabinet committee, etc. It comes from the highest, executive level in the land in any country. Now there are cautions there because they cannot, they can give general points about what are the threats, etc. So I don't think it is the it is correct or necessary for a national security strategy to have markers which enable each service or even jointly to say, okay, these are the things we want because that is mentioned there. A national security strategy might talk about multiple threats, strategic long-term threats, mid-term threats, etc. that come. And these threats are not only military threats. These threats are across the dime. There could be economic threats. There could be threats due to climate change, etc. All of that can be put in a classified version, and perhaps some of it can reflect in an unclassified version. It's not as if a NSS is completely, without merit. But to make it a meritorious document, a lot of thinking needs to go in. And that when you realize, how some countries' own NSS have not really helped them, you start wondering, therefore, what could be, and I don't have answers for this, what could be, a workable NSS. There are some places in the document that I have analyzed where, there are some very, very fine points. But overall, again, a national security strategy ought to help you strategically. And that remains the question mark when we analyze some of the major countries' strategic documents. In terms of, therefore, theaterization, since you asked there,
Yes.
I would say again that uh, the NSS or its presence or absence cannot really be, as I mentioned, either a deal maker or a deal breaker for theaterization. And this sort of observation, if I'm not wrong, has come out only in the past few months. Uh, of course, the absence of NSS has been highlighted by many people even years earlier, but it was never in the context of just theaterization. Now, it would be probably, it's difficult for me to understand how theaterization can be connected, to the absence or the inability to theaterize or the ill-advisability to theaterize be connected to the absence of an NSS. I'm sure the leadership of the services as well as, other departments which are looking at this have figured out a viable, theater strategy. And again, it need not be etched in stone. If it has to be tweaked, modified, we should do that. After all, policies need evaluation and re-evaluation, and strategic outcomes that come out of policies will also need those evaluations and re-evaluations.
Absolutely. They need to be flexible. That policy needs to be flexible. Also, the fact that these documents are not there in the public domain does not necessarily mean, in my view, that there is no national security strategy document in the confidential domain, in the secret domain. There may as well be a document on which the governments are taking this country to a direction which it hasn't gone to. For instance, today, when India is trying to be multi-aligned, or as we say, putting national interest above principles, this national security strategy, if it existed or if it exists in the secret domain, may not have had this approach written there. So leeway or the flexibility the government must have in not following what is written there. Like you said, it's not etched in stone, even if there was a national security strategy. So I think the armed forces also need to be flexible on that count. Would you think that the armed forces, in the absence of assuming that there is no national security strategy, would still know the mind of the executive who give the directions? For instance, the op directive of the Raksha Mantri or the Defense Minister, which is issued from time to time. would that be a sufficient marker for the armed forces to follow, or a kind of a set approach, or the roadmap that they need to evolve?
That's also an important observation, I think, that you make. The RM's op directive, as far as I know, is a classified document, but it has been mentioned, I think, in the public domain, so we can sort of acknowledge its existence here. It's probably, we have started reading too much into the word operational, with operations or operational level of warfare, etc. But the term operation is used in militaries and in governments very, very, very frequently at all levels, at the national strategic level, at the military strategic levels of war and warfare, and at the operational and even tactical level of warfare. So the smallest of tactical, operations can also be called an operation, and at the same time, something strategic like Parakram can also be called an operation. So I imagine that the operational directive of the Raksha Mantri or the Defense Minister lays down certain, very helpful guidelines for the armed forces to, start the processes of force planning. And I believe now there is a new system of force planning that DMA, in a collegiate way with the three service headquarters follows, and along with advice and the participation of maybe the National Security Council also. So there is now, if not a whole of government approach, one could say there is a much of government approach towards force planning issues, which I'm sure will yield, if done with the greatest of professionalism and sincerity, should yield uh, you know uh, wise force planning guidance, and therefore thereafter the acquisition plans for achieving those forces. And when we say force planning, it includes force structuring, not only purchases, because force acquisition, I think, is a very process driven thing. There are acquisition orders, there are steps to be taken. It's the planning that has to be ready, and for that, I think theaterization and future readiness for our armed forces will be dictated by the sincerity we put into examining the environment, and in then coming up with force planning, and thereafter force atmanirbharta, force manufacturing, force you know structuring, training, personnel management, maintenance, everything then comes in its own way. The other aspect is that whether the armed forces have enough sort of opportunities to read the senior leadership's minds. I think the fundamental sort of mistake we may be making here is in assuming that leadership at various levels interacts with each other only through the media, which would be which probably doesn't happen in any system, and it certainly doesn't happen in India. So uh, again, I would not know with what regularity, with what depth, uh, and with what consistency do leaders of various organizations interact with each other. But we have, therefore, the organizations already exist, whether it is the services headquarters, the DMA, the MOD part of it, various other ministries, so many coordination committees, DPG, uh, the National Security Council, the Cabinet Committee of Security, the cabinet itself,
Absolutely.
on
The
a broader
strategic
scale,
policy group, the
strategic
strategic policy
policy group.
group.
So I'm sure they are doing talking. How much of talking they are doing or not doing is something that we cannot second guess, uh,
Sure,
and I
I
think we
agree on
shouldn't
that.
do that.
We shouldn't do that, and I think that's where the crux of the matter lies. That to think that those who are in charge of national security, or even evolving India's foreign and defense policies, are not wise enough to implement their plans without a written document would be a folly. And therefore, I think while our job as commentators and observers is to start giving inputs, or is to give inputs on what could be a good measure of what India needs in the long run in securing itself. The fact is that a national security strategy can be as good as the implementation of it when it comes to the crunch. And that's where the proof of the pudding will lie, I suppose, going forward. Your last thoughts on this before we wind up?
Yes, Nitin, I agree. What perhaps a suggestion I have is that, you know, uh, national security strategies of other countries need to be studied in depth now. I've done a little bit of work on it, which is barely scratching the surface. I would say in many ways, but formally we need to study the national security strategies and what happened in the strategic environment for those countries, given the challenges that they had, and then look for the useful parts of their relevant national security strategies, and what didn't work out, and perhaps second guess why it did not work out. That might help us to look at national security strategies in the classified domain, which are as watertight as they can be, which is probably it's a wrong way of putting it. Strategy document should not be watertight. Cracks sometimes, as they say, let the light in. But nonetheless, what I do mean to say is that these documents ought to be thereafter written with the greatest of sort of sincerity and the greatest of clarity and professional integrity. And for that, I think the armed forces headquarters, maybe other organizations within the government need to look at other people's strategies from a different perspective to see. Let's see how did it help them or did it not help them.
Absolutely.
We have to, of course, go by the unclassified document, because they are the ones available to us. So that is perhaps one exercise. Is a broader suggestion to the last point that you raised.
No, certainly. And I think it's a useful point that you made as a kind of supporting argument to what I was saying as my last remarks there. But nonetheless, this is an ongoing debate and it will go on until the cows come home, I suppose, if we don't come to a conclusion. But there will be people who will come to a conclusion and implement the strategy quietly, whether it's a national security strategy or whether it's a defense doctrine or a defense document. That will depend on who's looking at which aspect of the national security strategy, irrespective of whether it is in the public domain or not, irrespective of whether it is written or not. I think India and its leaders and its decision makers will continue to face the challenges that face this country, even as we aspire to become a middling power or a middle power in terms of income, economic strength, and military wherewithal. But thank you very much, as usual. Brilliant insights into what is, in theory, an important aspect of governance, but in practice can become one of the bigger challenges to really implement. Thank you for your time, Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande.
Thank you very much. Pleasure as always.
Thank you. So, viewers, that was one of our foremost military thinkers giving us his view on what constitutes national security strategy and whether a national security strategy is important enough to be articulated publicly and then act as a guiding document for the Indian Armed Forces to implement the nation's strategy. That's all we have this time. And of course, keep sending us feedback. You know where to reach us. Our social media handles are visible on the screen. Your comments and feedback are always welcome. And of course, we will try and take up such thought-provoking topics from real experts of a particular aspect of diplomacy, military, and strategic issues. For the time being, it's goodbye.